Introducing Recorded Content, a podcast for small, scrappy B2B marketing teams who want to get the most out of podcasting. In each episode, we capture stories from industry experts and podcasters. Listen in and uncover what it takes to launch, run, and grow a successful B2B podcast. Check out and subscribe to the show on Spotify, Apple, or wherever you listen to your favorite shows. Let's jump in.
Hey, this is Tristan. I'm the co-founder of Motion and your host for this episode of Recorded Content. Recorded Content is brought to you by Motion, a done-for-you podcast agency for small, scrappy B2B tech marketers. In late 2020, Catalyst launched a podcast dedicated to customer success called NPS I Love You. And after launching, the company produced nearly 50 episodes, got over 100 5-star reviews on Apple, and tens of thousands of downloads. It became the most popular customer success podcast available. But after a year, Catalyst elected to rebrand the successful podcast and refine the strategy. In this episode, we'll learn about why Catalyst pivoted from NPS I Love You to Humans of SaaS, and we'll uncover the key lessons learned from rebranding the podcast. All right. Well, Ben, first of all, thanks for joining me on Recorded Content today.
Thanks for having me. Happy to be here.
All right. Well, to start off, I thought that, at least from my perspective, I feel like pretty much every technology company can benefit from a podcast. And according to Chartable, which is, we had the CEO of Chartable on Recorded Content not too long ago, they have a stat where they recognized at least 600 branded podcasts that were created in 2020. So you fall into that boat with the podcast that you launched in 2020. So what was the spark to NPS I Love You originally?
Well, we were wanting to just experiment. We were wanting to see, is this something that people want? Is it something they'll listen to? I have always been a fan of podcasting for, at least the last 5 years. And so it was something I really wanted to experiment with as a community builder turned marketer. So those are sort of the same thing now. So yeah, we just sort of wanted to do it as a way to raise brand awareness and engage with our audience in a new way.
And so when you started that and then you're working with launching this podcast, which was very early on in your role, right? Because you started shortly after COVID hit, I believe. Right?
Yeah, I was hired in March, and then was supposed to start in May, which is when everything went to shit. And so my entire role changed. And then this got accelerated because of COVID. It was, okay, we can't run these in-person events now. So what are other ways that we can build community and build our brand in this space? And obviously podcasting is a great alternative. Yeah,
definitely. And how did you come about with the concept of the original show? Like, did you go through a creative brief process internally, or what was that genesis like of the show from the very early stages?
Well, so off the bat, we were just like, we're building a customer success platform. So let's do a customer success podcast. And I had been listening to the other customer success podcasts out there, some of which I'm still a big fan of, but I still felt that there was a gap that we could fill with what we were envisioning. And then in terms of the name, we always try to insert humor where we can. So we did that as sort of a company brainstorm. I just posted our Slack channel and got about 100 suggestions. And it was actually our manager of revenue operations that came up with NPS I Love You, which if you're in customer success or customer experience, you're probably very familiar with NPS. Hopefully you're also familiar with the Gerard Butler movie, which is sort of where the joke was coming from. And I'm sure we'll get into this later, but that was actually one of the reasons for the rebrand, is that a lot of people did not get that we were joking. And then that just became a meaningless thing for them.
Very, very interesting. Yeah. The early stages of a podcast, you're coming up with the name, you're brainstorming internally, you have like this momentum. Like, what was the overarching goal for the podcast early on? Like, what did you set out from the very beginning there?
I laid the ground. I was very specific with the leaders at Catalyst when I joined, that a lot of the things we were going to do for community building and for brand building were not things where we would turn around the next day and be like, okay, here's the ROI on what I did last week. And podcasting is something I include in that. Unless you're advertising or you're, really, employing some very specific strategy, your podcast is not going to generate revenue for you tomorrow. It's going to generate revenue for you 3 months, 6 months, 2 years down the road. And so, we were looking at engagement, basically. Can we get the guests we want to get? Do we get good feedback? Are we getting good reviews? We were going, is it doing its job of elevating our brand awareness? Are people listening to it, sharing it? That was sort of the initial one. Now, when we look back, okay, we can look at some of these harder metrics around ROI. But to begin with, it was just like, is this something that provides value to people? Because that's what we lead with all of our marketing efforts. If it provides value, then it'll pay off either in the short term or the long term, but eventually it'll pay off.
And guests are a big part of a podcast, a lot of branded podcasts. And I believe you had over 45 guests in the season one, but talk to me a little bit about the guest profile that you envisioned for that first season.
Well, the first episode, and I always recommend it, you got to start off strong. So of course I had my CEO on, not just because he's my CEO, but because he'd been through a hell of a year. His brother had been in a coma and nearly died from COVID. He was raising a then 1-year-old baby with his wife in the city. And he was also raising Catalyst Series B all at the same time. And so I was like, well, we need to talk. And I also know that he has no hesitation in getting vulnerable, and he's an extremely authentic person and a great speaker. So he absolutely killed it. And that first episode, I think it still was our most listened to episode of the entire season. And we still get people reaching out and saying they applied to Catalyst because they heard Edward's very first podcast episode. So that was, I wouldn't say he was our typical profile, but he was definitely the best person we could have started with. And then we experimented with a few different people. It started out with me trying to get a varying, profile. Sometimes it was a customer success leader. Sometimes it was a magician. Sometimes it was a FBI negotiator. Like, it was really across the board with the goal of, let's learn from people who do all these different things and always bring it back to customer success. And then over the course of the season, it evolved to be much more focused on customer success leaders, VPs, CCOs, people who we're trying to sell to, essentially. Not the specific speaker, but, people who match the profile of our ICP.
And I was listening to the season one wrap up episode that you did. It was a solo episode. And that was the last episode of NPS I Love You. And one of the things that you talked about was just how experimentation was important to you on the podcast. And you did a lot of things differently. Some episodes were heavily scripted with a very clear outline and questions, whereas other ones were a little bit more freeform. Why was experimentation so important, do you think, in that first season?
You never know what is going to resonate with your audience. I mean, I to use a pretty obvious example, I mean, Joe Rogan's the biggest podcast out there. And I mean, obviously it took him years to build up to the audience that he has. But I mean, no one could have predicted that these 3-hour free-flowing, absolutely no structure kind of podcasts with no specific takeaways a lot of the time would be the largest podcast in the world, I believe. Not to say that that's the best kind, but just to say that you can never really predict. It's the same way with product. Like, you can make educated guesses, but you still need to test and validate and experiment and try and A/B test and try new things in order to figure out what the best fit is going to be. And so it's the same with podcasting. Experiment with structure, with guest profiles, with length, with format, everything.
And Ben, I know you're obviously a community and events is a big piece of your role. What experience did you had with podcasting prior to launching season one?
None. I'd hosted events. I have a theater background from way back, and that has helped me a lot in a lot of ways in my career. But yeah, no, absolutely no experience. Just being a fan and having hosted events and that sort of thing was helpful.
So what was your approach? So if you're new to podcasting and you're creating a branded podcast for your company, you're new in your role, like how did you know that it was time to maybe try something new for an episode or go a slightly different way? Like, what led you down that path?
There were some episodes where I felt myself disconnecting and I was like, I am bored as shit. I wish I wasn't doing this right now. If I'm bored, the listeners are going to be bored. And this is while I'm nodding and smiling at the guests and, trying to maintain composure and all of that. And so I was like, that when I think that happened 2 or 3 times in season one, and I was like, okay, I need to change something about this. And so the next episode, I'd be like, okay, I'm not sending questions in advance. I'm only telling them like a general topic, and then we're going to see where it goes. I'm going to edit it down. And then when that got stale, it was like, okay, now I'm going to not go after, the same profile. I'm going to find someone who's a brand new kind of profile to bring on. And so you keep what works and you let go what doesn't.
And what were some of those experiments that you felt really didn't land that well? And you're like, I'm just going to pull this one to the side and we're not going to do that again.
I mean, initially, I would say one of the very first ones I learned was sending a full exact question list in advance. I did an episode where I saw someone reading their answers. And when I tried to add in a question that that I hadn't originally sent them, they were like, can we stick to the ones that you sent me? And it took me completely out of the conversation. It just sounded completely robotic, and it was not fun for me. And I'm sure for our listeners either. So, going fully scripted with all the questions sent in advance is not something that I found was conducive to the kind of conversations I wanted to have. That's definitely one that comes to mind. And then another would be, I say, asking similar questions in each episode. Mm-hmm. So for example, it was recommended to me, a great question to ask is, what's an unpopular opinion you have, or what is an opinion you have about your industry that others would disagree with? Mm-hmm. Great question to throw in every so often, but shouldn't ask that to every single guest, every single episode the exact same way. I mean, think about any great interview you've ever listened to or watched, whether it's David Letterman's, my next guest needs no introduction, or it's an Oprah interview from the 90s, or it's, mm-hmm. any great interview. They never ask the same questions twice. Every question they've come up with is customized to that person's experiences. Maybe they had a conversation before with that guest, and then they uncovered some unpopular opinion that guest holds, and then they came up with a bunch of questions on that so that it would come out during the interview. But everything is personalized to that guest. Otherwise, it's kind of like, it's similar to doing a blog, right? A lot of times you can read blogs where you're like, okay, I know their content person wrote 5 questions, sent the same 5 questions to 50 people, and then they just publish the same thing every week. And that's fine. Yeah. And it works sometimes, and it's okay for SEO and that sort of thing. But those aren't the blogs where you're like, holy shit, you need to read this. So yeah, doing the work to customize everything as much as possible really makes a difference in terms of the value of the answer you get. And one of the other things I would say too is, you want to get especially with content like this, you want to get to the heart of the episode as quickly as possible, to those moments that are really unique or interesting. And if you're starting with what is an unpopular opinion you hold, then they have to answer that. Then you ask the next level, you go a little deeper, and then they answer that. Then you go a little deeper and they answer that. And if you can already know what the thing is that's unpopular or controversial or important that you want to touch on them, you can skip those first couple layers and you go right into, I know you feel this. Let's explore why, and let's explore how that manifests. And you can really dig deep off the bat, which brings people in.
Yeah. And that's a big part of the research process, I feel too, is like, you can really gather some of those moments if you're doing that research up front. So Ben, what is your approach to research in order to really customize some of those questions in your approach to each guest?
Well, now, since the rebrand, my goal, and what I've found has worked quite well, has been to make every episode revolve around a story. And I make it very clear to the person, whether they're a customer success leader or a founder or, an author or a psychologist, I make it clear that, you're not coming on, yes, we're a customer success company, but that's not what we're here to talk about. We're called Humans of SaaS. It's about the human side of tech. So what I do now is I talk to guests ahead of time, either through email or over Zoom or something like that. And I'll uncover a story that we're going to focus on, that I know we're going to touch on. Like our first episode of the season was Rand Fishkin talking about how he lost $14 million in one day, and how one email changed the trajectory of his entire company, SparkToro. And that makes it a lot easier to then come up with all of the really specific questions. And of course, I do my Googling and I do my stalking online.
And so that's a different approach than what you had with season 1. So looking at season 1 and in that last episode that you recorded solo, it was a wrap up episode. You knew that you were rebranding and moving forward with something different. Like how did you feel? How did Catalyst feel about season 1? Once you looked at those 50 or so episodes, like how did that compare where you were at that point versus when you started with the founder or CEO in episode 1?
It's funny because I would say that we accomplished everything we'd hoped, right? We're in the top podcast in customer success in terms of ratings and reviews and that sort of thing, which was important to us. Now, we've got some hilariously ambitious founders. So, my COO, I think his goal was, okay, let's become the top podcast in the world. Like that's still something that I think he would contest that he's looking for. And then our CEO, they're brothers. Our CEO is a bit more measured, and I think he's probably pretty happy to have us being the top customer success podcast. So from my perspective, I was like, great, we proved there was a gap. We established ourselves in the space. We made an impact. People know about this. We can get a lot of guests, we had a lot of downloads. So it was, okay, we've come this far. Like, how can we take this further? How can we make this not stale? How can we take it to the next level? And that was part of the impetus for the rebrand.
Yeah. And I want to make sure our listeners know, like, for most technology companies, where you stood probably at the end of season 1 was really a great spot. So just let me set the stage here. There were over 50 episodes, I believe, that you recorded, like 45 external guests that you brought on. I have here over 100 5-star reviews. You have tens of thousands of downloads, and it's all really focused on your ICP, which customer success folks.
Yeah.
So, but even with all that success, after just one season, you decided to rebrand it. So what was the spark that said, hey, this just isn't quite right. We do need to pivot into something that's new, which resulted in season 2?
Yeah. I mean, there were a few things. One being a bit selfish in that I feel like I can't deliver an optimal experience, an optimal episode for our guests, our guests and our listeners, if I am not personally excited by the person I'm speaking with and the topic I'm speaking about. And customer success gets very old very quickly. It's interesting. I love it as an industry. I love the people in it so much. It's fantastic. But is it something that I want to, I'm working all day on, is it something where I also want to spend extra time podcasting about? Also, when there are several great customer success podcasts out there, are we that different that, we should keep doing this route when I feel like it's a little bit duplicative and there are others who are doing this extremely well? So that was sort of the first couple things. I mentioned the name before. That was big. Because the idea was, if we want to continue, now that we've become the dominant podcast in the CS space, if we want to go beyond this and we want to start bringing awareness of Catalyst to people who are in marketing roles, in customer experience roles, in, who are founders and CEOs of other SaaS companies, they're not searching for customer success in Apple Podcasts. They might search for tech, SaaS, stuff like that. So how can we engage them? Because our title already cuts them off at the source. We got so many notes of people saying, hey, like, I don't like NPS. And we're like, that's not what the show is about. Like, we're not saying we love NPS. It's a joke. Like, and people just didn't get that. And so we needed something a little more straightforward that was very clearly something that a lot of people could relate to. And it opened the door to more guests, because try inviting someone who doesn't know what NPS is to be on a show called NPS I Love You. Like, it's not an easy task.
Right.
And so, this was a doorway to that.
So with all those things that you're looking to accomplish, what did you do differently with the brand development with the new podcast compared to what you did with season 1?
It was much more intentional. We knew that we wanted to go after stories, in particular human interest stories, at the risk of sounding like a 90s broadcaster. Like, we were like, okay, we want to get like what's most interesting. The reason that Edward's episode was so great as our first episode ever was that we didn't talk about Catalyst or customer success. We talked about his experience with his brother, with his daughter, raising this round, being under pressure, how he handled that pressure, mental health. Like, that's the stuff that really resounds with people. And I should have said, one of the biggest pieces of feedback I got, where I'm like, I can't believe it took me 40 episodes to realize this. So shout out to Steph Walder from Lattice, because she pointed this out to me. She was like, I don't listen to your podcast. She said, I'm doing customer success all day. It's all I'm thinking about. Why would I want to listen to another hour or 30 minutes of customer success content on my way home or on my way to work? I was like, that makes absolute sense. I wouldn't either. I don't listen to podcasts about podcasting on my way to or from work. I might listen to it if someone is like, oh, there's some great advice in this, or check this out because it'll help you. But, I listen to stories. I listen to true crime or interviews or, stuff that just interests me as a human. So it was definitely intentional to create something that people would enjoy listening to after work, that was interesting, relaxing, still generally related to things they were interested in. But would also solve that issue.
So the one thing with that, Ben, like if you do broaden out and you go more story, like broader stories, you do enter this environment where you're competing with a lot of the big boys, right? That are also storytelling and reaching a broader audience. So what were you planning to do differently to help Humans of SaaS, which was the new brand that resulted from that scenario where you went from season 1 to season 2? How are you going to stand out when you're competing with kind of like this whole different set of shows?
I mean, we're definitely competing against a different set of shows, but not for the same audience. There aren't a lot of B2B SaaS podcasts. There are some for sure, but it's not like we're competing with all podcasts that do storytelling. Even I would consider like How I Built This, like an amazing podcast, but we're not quite competing with them because they don't have B2B SaaS companies and founders. They focus specifically on B2C companies and B2C founders. So there is competition, but not necessarily for the same audience. And even when we were going after our niche, we're still competing against all the other things that they could be doing with their time and all the other podcasts. Like, why listen to us over My Favorite Murder, right? Or one of these other, major podcasts. So I've always kind of had this approach of let's try it and let's see if people like it. And if we don't need, in my mind, I mean, again, our COO probably has a different outlook, but in my mind, we don't have to be the top podcast in the industry. I just need to make an impact at Catalyst. I just need to grow the Catalyst brand and engage with people and deliver interesting content, and I'm happy. And so, yeah, it's sort of how I think about the competition side.
Yeah, and you mentioned one of the top reasons for rebranding or pivoting the show was for selfish reasons, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's a big thing that folks don't understand until they actually get into the podcasting process is, as a host, you have to be genuinely curious yourself. If not, it does come across as just going through these steps, right?
Mm-hmm.
And you're just getting information versus really serving as a conduit for your audience and being curious. So when did you feel, Ben, that season 2 was going to be on the right track? Like, did you have a creative brief? Did you do an internal brainstorming? Like, what did that process consist of to where you said, okay, I'm ready to record season 2, episode 1?
It wasn't too crazy a process internally, which I like. Again, just I'm an impatient person, so I drew up a brief. I think it was 1 page, maybe 2 pages, outlining key changes and changes to format, changes to audience, all that kind of stuff, and then sent it off for feedback. Got some notes, discussed with our leadership, and then I crafted questions. And once I had gotten Rand confirmed for our first episode, I was really excited. He's an incredible guy and done amazing things. So, it was pretty easy once that had sort of taken shape. Once I'd figured out that the key was having a story to center each episode around. That was ultimately the biggest change. Once that was figured out, everything else sort of fell into place.
And when you made that change to say, okay, we're going to focus on stories, like what was the plan to get those stories for each one? Because that does take another level of work, right? To kind of surface those interesting moments that you can explore in an episode.
For sure. So there's a couple things that I do. One, if I see a great LinkedIn post, I pounce. So if someone's sharing, like a friend of mine, Bradley Liu, who I recorded with a few weeks ago, his episode is out. He posted a LinkedIn message maybe 3 months ago talking about how he had quit his job with no plan. He was burning out. His family was going through all this struggle. His wife had postpartum depression, and he just needed to take the time. And then he disappeared for a month. And so I was like, okay, when you're back, we need to talk. Mm-hmm. And so I had him on the show and we talked about that. And I've done that a few times. I'm recording with someone next week who dealt with, I believe, testicular cancer, and because it's November, so wanting to talk about his journey and his story. And again, that came through a social media post that I saw and I reached out. Sometimes I'll see someone come up with a book. And so again, perfect way I can read about them, read about their book, and then reach out and know that I can come up with something really custom. A guest for the sake of a guest is never a good plan. I'd rather have someone who is a junior associate, entry level, whatever, with an incredible story than someone who is a CEO who talks like cardboard. And I've encountered both. And so that was a big learning for me as well.
And with those stories so once you identify those, whether it's a LinkedIn post or something else that you've seen where someone has expressed kind of like tidbits of a story, how do you get some of the details? Do you do a pre-call with each one of these and then go into an episode, or what's that process to get to that actual recording session?
Sometimes I do. Often it's more of a sync over email. I don't know if this is something you struggle with as well, but I am paranoid about missing great content. So even in a preamble, now when I go on a podcast, I try to hit record as soon as possible, even if we're still doing our chat, because who knows what golden nugget they're going to say. And then you're like, fuck, I wish we were recording so I could, sorry, I don't know if I can swear on your show, but
you're welcome to do that. Yeah.
I wish I could go back and have that recorded. And you never want to ask someone to repeat something, especially if it's something that was a joke or an offhanded comment or something like that. So I try to, if I need to clarify a couple things, I will reach out and I'll ask, but generally I'll just send some high level topics and some general areas I want to explore. And then I'll come up with all my own questions. We'll figure it out over the course of the show.
Yeah. That the fear that you have of missing something in that pre-call, I don't know if I've ever really thought about it in those terms, but I really do share that with you. And we didn't do a pre-call here. The really spark for this conversation was a blog post that I saw online, and I saw that you wrote about the switch from season 1 to season 2, and that really caught me by surprise because the show was so successful, but there was something there. There were several reasons that you've gone through here that you wanted to pivot the show and take it somewhere else. And I feel like a lot of folks that I interact with have a similar struggle, right? And I didn't want to lose any of that information in a pre-call that might be very interesting to have in the episode itself. So I think it's very interesting that you're coming at it with that perspective, even with the story-driven approach that you're taking with season 2. So with season 2, you have these stories that you're diving into. Like what else was a big change that you wanted to make with just the structure of your episodes?
I wanted to make them more free-flowing. More conversational. Again, that came with having a story and removing the questions ahead of time. So it does feel like more of a conversation. I also sort of knew where I wanted to push the guest to end up talking about. So sort of beginning with the end in mind, to use, I think it's a Covey framework or whatever, but kind of sort of knowing where you want to end up, where you want them to, not necessarily what you want them to say specifically, but if you know that there's a certain apex of the episode or a certain subject you want to explore, having that in mind. I definitely do that now. I've also found, and it's hard because I want the episode to be about the guest and the guest experience, but feedback I've also gotten is that people enjoy when I chime in with different anecdotes or things that I can relate to personally. Just like you just did with the, your experience also being afraid about missing good content on the preamble. And so that's something I've also tried to be a bit more intentional about, because in season 1, I was a little more reserved. I wanted to make sure that, I was giving the guests the full spotlight on everything. And that doesn't let the regular audience who's returning get to know you, because you're the one consistent thing from episode to episode. And it's something I haven't sort of thought of in that way before, but that's actually a great retention strategy, is to insert as much of yourself as possible. Obviously, you don't want to overshadow the guest, but by, letting them know you better bit by bit over the course of an episode or a season is a great strategy to build a loyal audience, regardless of what the name of your show is or which specific guest you have on.
Yeah. And how do you feel about season 2 now? I mean, you started with Rand Fishkin out of the gate, really great guest. He's a good storyteller himself.
Great storyteller, yeah.
How do you feel about the rebrand now that you're several episodes in season 2?
Great. I mean, it's one of those things where I don't think a rebrand is ever easy, but I think we did it at the right time. Like and that was a discussion we had internally where like, if we're going to do it, this is the time. I was like, if we keep going down this route, we're just going to build our audience, build our awareness, and then it's going to be even harder and even bigger a deal a year from now, 5 years from now. So it wasn't easy, but I'm glad we did it when we did it. And it has accomplished what we hoped it would. It's opened the doors to, it's, I would say, a bit of good, a bit of negative, right? So in terms of, we're not 100% focused on customer success now. So, I wouldn't say our customer success audience has gone down a lot, but it's not, we're no longer being featured on customer success podcasts you need to listen to. And, if someone is turning to podcasts for customer success, Humans of SaaS is not going to be the first one that comes up. At least I don't think it is. Even though some of our guests are customer success leaders. So, there was a bit of a step back in that perspective, but in another way, it's allowed us to take 3 steps forward in that I've been able to get guests on that I normally wouldn't have been able to get on. I'm getting more pitches now from press agents and people who want our authors or founders featured on the show, which is something I wasn't getting before. It's just more broadly applicable now. So we have more leeway with the direction the conversations go. We've talked about diversity. We've talked about handicaps at work. We've talked about, early stage, like founding companies and everything in between. And before, that wasn't really, now the topics align with the concept of the show. If you come to NPS I Love You, you're not expecting to hear about, what it's like being blind and leading a tech company. You're expecting to hear strategies about customer success. Coming to Humans of SaaS, you're getting what you came for essentially now because we're delivering those stories to you.
Yeah. And you mentioned, Ben, that it felt like the right time at the point you made that rebrand after season 1. So if you were speaking to another B2B marketer, they're at a similar size tech company, like what would you advise them as far as some signs to look out for as to when it does feel like a time to make a more drastic change like a rebrand?
I would say when it's becoming stale, and not in terms of, you're losing listeners and it's bad and no one cares about your show, but it just feels stale for you. Maybe some people you trust are, saying, yeah, it's sort of repetitive because same kind of guests, same kind of conversations, all that kind of stuff. Never let it go stale. Once it feels stale, it's time for a rebrand or to kill it altogether and start a new show. That's something we don't talk about enough. Like it's completely fine. And we talked about doing that with NPS I Love You, is saying, okay, that show is done. Here's a brand new show. We didn't do that, but it was something we talked about, and it's a perfectly valid option to do that as well. I think once you've gained an understanding of what you like, what you don't like, what your audience likes, what they don't like, whether you're accomplishing your goals or not, that's the best decision to say, either we're going to double down on what we've been doing because it's working and we love it, our audience loves it, or we're going to pivot in this way and hope that most of our audience comes with us and that it opens new doors.
Yeah, and I even went further down a path, and like you mentioned about throwing a show completely away. That's what I did. We had over 300 episodes of a show called Tech Qualified, and my business partner and I threw it away, and we started this recorded content. We decided to go very, very niche and focused into a certain area. So we went from broad to a smaller, tighter audience, which is the exact opposite of what you are doing. And the interesting thing about that is I feel like it works in both. It can work in both ways. And this goes back to one of the big things that you mentioned is just the host being genuinely curious and excited to do each episode. So what about being a host, like what benefits have you received from running both season 1 and now season 2?
I mean, I've been able to broadly expand my network and build my personal and professional brand. I've also become a better interviewer for sure, a better speaker. I've learned about audio equipment that I didn't think I needed to learn. There's been a lot that I've personally benefited from out of running this podcast. And it's given me confidence where if I wanted to launch another podcast, whether it was for Catalyst with a different company, if it was a personal thing, I know I could do that. And I'm confident it would be successful, which is something I wouldn't have had before. So I feel like I could go on for a while, but personal benefits that I've gotten out of hosting it. I mean, my best advice, like if you can find those things that are, if you picture the Venn diagram, that are good for the company and also good for you, that's where you should be spending like 80% of your time if you can. You just have to be able to convince your leadership that it's a good idea for them as much as it is for you.
Absolutely. Yeah, I agree with that. And when you talk about convincing leadership, like what comes to mind as far as some customer feedback or folks like that you interact with these shows? Like what's been the best moment of feedback that you've received?
There's definitely a few. I mean, personally, and on a very superficial level, what a VP of CS of a prominent tech company coming up to me and having met her for the first time that night and telling me I'm the Oprah of customer success was probably the best compliment I've received in my entire life.
Yeah, doesn't get much better than that.
I know, right? On a deeper level, I mean, I think internally getting feedback from my leadership and our sales team that this is making a difference, where they are having the podcast come up on demos and they're having the podcast come out. They're able to use it as an outreach method. If we talk about a certain concept or a story, they're able to work it into their outreach in a way that is genuine and offers value to the person who they're emailing. So it's not just like a meaningless, shitty SDR email. You're getting something where it's like, hey, this specific time, in this 23 minutes into this episode, there's a question about this. I know this is something you've been working on, so I thought it would be helpful. Like, that's a great thing for our sales team to be able to reach out. And it makes me feel great that something I have so much fun doing can provide that sort of value as well. And then from customers, I mean, one of the biggest things I would say is I've been able to, customers and prospects, I've just been able to elevate voices in the industry that otherwise weren't elevated. There's a lot of people in our space that are very loud with their personal brands, which is phenomenal. But there's a lot of people that are just so focused on executing really well day to day that they're not allocating so much time to their personal brand. And so those are people that I can reach out to and say, hey, like, I know you're doing amazing stuff. Can you come on the show and talk with me about it? Or I know that you went through this personal journey recently. Like, would you come on the show and talk about it? And that helps build their brand and helps them do what they're doing. So that's the other side that I've really appreciated and enjoyed.
Yeah, and Ben, last question for you. How has the podcast really helped you tie the community part of your role? How has it helped bridge that, especially in this time of a pandemic?
It's another outlet for us to communicate our brand and for people to, for lack of a better word, fall in love with Catalyst. Like, you want to build as many of those opportunities as possible so that, because everyone likes to engage differently. Some people like events, remote events. Some people like in-person stuff. Some people like podcasts. Some people like blogs. Some people like videos. Like, there's, a million different channels for marketers, and podcasting has definitely been one that for some people couldn't care less. And then other ones, they absolutely love and are thrilled that we do it. So it's been a way for us to bring them into the Catalyst community, and communicate what that community is about, because we're not building a community where you just come and you share your customer success strategies and you talk about, comp structure and that sort of thing. We're building a community where you talk about mental health, where you talk about how you can adapt what you're doing or find a new job or be an incredible leader or manager, or be accommodating to those around you who, might be going through struggles or have disabilities that you don't know about. That's the kind of community we're building, and we're able to communicate that on a weekly basis through Humans of SaaS. And we're also able to inspire. I think that's been the biggest thing for me personally, is I have felt more inspired doing this season than ever before, because I'm speaking with founders who, they did incredibly, built billion-dollar companies. And, some of them started with like $2,000, like $3,000 and doing this on the side and doing whatever. And I just love that, because it's, I was going to say demythicizing. That's absolutely not a word.
We'll check our resources to see if it's a word or not.
It's definitely not a word. Demystifying. That's what I was going for. It's demystifying, this sort of romantic idea of the entrepreneur. And it's like, no, if you have a good idea and you have a few $1,000 to spare, you can test something out and, maybe it'll turn into $1 billion company. And that's a pretty cool message to be able to leave with people.
Yeah, I love it. But that's a good spot to end. I mean, I appreciate you sharing your story here, because I know, when you go through a rebrand like that, you're kind of sticking your neck out there, because your season one was very effective. You had a lot of success there, but then it's just like not settling for that and really just constantly challenging yourself. And I think this will be a big help for a lot of folks that we interact with. So thanks for going through that. So I'll ask you, where can people go to find out more about you and Catalyst?
You can check out catalyst.io. We just launched a whole library of tech memes at csmemes.io. But you can also just find me on LinkedIn. I'm always happy to help if I can, happy to chat about stuff. And if you're looking for a customer success platform, let me know.
All right. Awesome. Well, Ben, thanks for joining me on Recorded Content today.
Thank you so much for having me, Tristan. It was a lot of fun.